June 14th, 2023, 12:03 p.m. 26-year-old Emily Carter walks into a downtown coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, and according to surveillance footage, she never walks out. At first, nothing about the video seems unusual. Emily steps through the glass door, pauses briefly at the counter, and glances at her phone. She looks calm, unhurried, exactly where she's supposed to be on a Wednesday afternoon. The cameras track her movements clearly. Every entrance, every exit, every table. And yet, when investigators reviewed the footage, something didn't add up. Because over the next 4 hours, dozens of people come and go. Staff rotate shifts. Deliveries arrive. Customers sit, drink, and leave. But Emily Carter is never seen exiting the building. Police believed they had the full picture. Detectives said the footage told a complete story. But it didn't. What everyone missed was already there, buried in plain sight. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. June 14th, 2023, 12:03 p.m. 26-year-old Emily Carter walks into a downtown coffee shop in Portland, Oregon, and according to surveillance footage, she never walks out. At first, nothing about the video seems unusual. Emily steps through the glass door, pauses briefly at the counter, and glances at her phone. She looks calm, unhurried, exactly where she's supposed to be on a Wednesday afternoon. The cameras track her movements clearly. Every entrance, every exit, every table. And yet, when investigators reviewed the footage, something didn't add up. Because over the next 4 hours, dozens of people come and go. Staff rotate shifts. Deliveries arrive. Customers sit, drink, and leave. But Emily Carter is never seen exiting the building. Police believed they had the full picture. Detectives said the footage told a complete story. But it didn't. What everyone missed was already there, buried in plain sight. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Emily Carter was not the kind of person who disappeared without explanation. Friends described her as deliberate, structured, and almost methodical in the way she lived her life. She planned her weeks in advance, kept her calendar meticulously updated, and rarely deviated from routine without telling someone. If she was going to be late, she texted. If she changed plans, she called. Silence, for Emily, was never accidental. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, mostly from her apartment in Southeast Portland. It gave her flexibility, but it also meant her days followed a quiet rhythm. Mornings began early, usually before 8. Coffee at home, emails, design drafts. By late morning, she often left the apartment for a few hours, choosing one of 3 nearby cafes to work from. She rotated between them, not out of spontaneity, but out of preference. Each place offered something slightly different. One was quieter, one had better lighting, and one, the one she entered that day, had a corner table she liked because it faced the window, but kept her back to the wall. It was a small detail, but it said a lot about Emily. She liked to see what was happening around her. But this is where everything begins to matter. Emily had moved to Portland just under 2 years earlier. She grew up in Boise, Idaho, in a close-knit family that still spoke almost daily. Her parents described her as independent, but deeply connected. She visited home during holidays, remembered birthdays without reminders, and never let more than a few days pass without checking in. Her younger brother, Daniel, said she was the kind of person who noticed things others didn't. The one who caught subtle changes, small inconsistencies, quiet signals. It made what happened next even harder to understand. On the morning of June 14th, Emily followed her routine exactly. At 7:42 a.m., she sent an email to a client with revised logo concepts. At 9:15, she joined a scheduled video call that lasted just under an hour. At 10:31, she texted her friend Marissa confirming dinner plans for later that evening. Nothing in her messages suggested stress, urgency, or distraction. If anything, she sounded relaxed. At 11:47 a.m., She left her apartment. Security footage from her building shows her stepping into the hallway, wearing a light gray sweater, dark jeans, and white sneakers. Her hair is tied back. She carries her laptop bag over one shoulder and a reusable coffee cup in her hand. She locks the door behind her, checks it once, then walks toward the elevator. It's a small, habitual gesture, the kind you don't think about, the kind that suggests she expected to come back. She never did. At 11:52 a.m., she exits the building and turns left onto the street. A nearby traffic camera captures her crossing the intersection, waiting patiently for the signal even though no cars are approaching. Again, nothing unusual, nothing rushed. Just Emily, moving through her day. At 12:03 p.m., she enters the coffee shop. What happens after that becomes the center of everything. But to understand why this case unsettled investigators so deeply, you have to understand one more thing about Emily Carter. She was careful, not paranoid, not fearful, just aware. She didn't share her location publicly. She didn't overshare online. Her social media presence was minimal, mostly work-related posts and occasional photos with friends. She avoided conflict, but she wasn't naive. If something felt off, she noticed. And yet, there was no indication that anything felt off that day. Marissa would later tell investigators that Emily seemed excited about dinner. They had plans to try a new Thai restaurant that had just opened downtown. Emily had picked a place. She had even sent a screenshot of the menu that morning with a message that read, "We have to try this." But this is where the timeline starts to narrow. At 12:11 p.m., inside the coffee shop, Emily orders a drink. The cashier remembers her vaguely. Nothing specific, just that she seemed polite, maybe a little quiet. The order is routine. An iced latte with oat milk. She pays with her card. The transaction goes through instantly. At 12:14 p.m., she takes her drink and walks toward the back of the cafe. This is the last moment anyone can confidently describe her actions without relying entirely on video. And even then, something feels incomplete, because the more investigators learned about Emily's habits, the more one question kept surfacing. Why that table? Out of all the available seats, Emily chooses the far back corner. Not her usual spot, not the one by the window. This table is partially obscured from the main camera angle. It sits just beyond a structural column, where only part of the seating area is visible on surveillance. It's a subtle difference, easy to overlook, but this is where everything changes. From that position, Emily is still technically on camera. You can see her shoulder, part of her arm, the edge of her laptop when she sets it down, but her full movements are no longer clearly visible. Anyone approaching her from certain angles would also be partially hidden. At the time, no one thought that mattered. At 12:19 p.m., she opens her laptop. At 12:26 p.m., she takes a sip of her drink. At 12:32 p.m., she checks her phone. Each action is logged not by intention, but by observation. Investigators would later go through the footage frame by frame, building a timeline from fragments, small movements, subtle shifts. But what they didn't realize then was that the most important moment had already happened, and no one noticed it, because everyone was watching Emily. No one was watching what was happening just behind her. At 12:03 p.m., Emily Carter steps into the coffee shop, and from that moment forward, the entire case becomes a matter of minutes, angles, and what the cameras appear to show. At 12:11 p.m., she orders her drink. At 12:14, she moves toward the back corner. By 12:19, her laptop is open. At 12:26, she lifts her cup. At 12:32, she checks her phone. Everything is documented. Everything seems ordinary. But this is where the timeline tightens, and where perception begins to drift away from reality. At 12:41 p.m., a man enters the cafe wearing a dark baseball cap and a loose gray hoodie. He pauses briefly near the entrance. scanning the room in a way that doesn't immediately stand out, but later becomes significant. He does not approach the counter right away. Instead, he steps aside, as if deciding whether to stay. He is visible on camera for less than 10 seconds before moving out of the main frame. At the time, no one gives him a second thought. At 12:44 p.m., a delivery driver walks in carrying 2 large boxes. The front camera captures the brief congestion near the entrance as customers shift to make space. The back camera, partially obstructed by the column, shows only fragments of movement. Shadows passing, a shoulder, the edge of a sleeve. Emily remains seated. At 12:52 p.m., one of the baristas rotates off shift. She later tells investigators she remembers glancing toward the back and seeing a woman with a laptop, likely Emily, still working. Nothing unusual. No sign of distress. No raised voices. No sudden movement. At 1:03 p.m., another customer sits at a table 2 spots away from Emily. He stays for approximately 18 minutes. During questioning, he says he never noticed anything unusual. He doesn't recall anyone speaking to her. He doesn't recall her leaving. And that detail becomes critical, because from 12:14 p.m. onward, no camera captures Emily standing up. No footage shows her walking toward the door. No image shows her exiting the building. But this is where everything begins to unravel. At 1:17 p.m., the man in the gray hoodie reappears, this time moving toward the counter. He places an order, keeps his head slightly lowered, and pays in cash. The camera captures only a partial view of his face, enough to confirm his presence, not enough to clearly identify him. He collects his drink at 1:20 p.m. Then, instead of leaving, he turns toward the back of the cafe, toward Emily. The angle makes it difficult to follow his exact path. The column blocks a portion of the view. What remains visible is fragmented. A shift in shadow, a brief movement near the edge of the frame, and then he's gone. Not out the front door, not through any visible exit, just no longer clearly trackable. At 1:26 p.m., the customer seated near Emily gathers his things and leaves. He walks past the camera, exits through the front door, and disappears from view. Emily does not follow. At 1:34 p.m., a group of 3 enters and occupies a table closer to the front. The cafe becomes slightly busier. Conversations overlap. Movement increases. The back corner becomes less noticeable, less observed. At 1:42 p.m., one of the baristas walks toward the back to wipe down an empty table. She later states that she did not approach Emily directly, but she believes she saw someone still seated there. When pressed, she cannot be certain if it was Emily or someone else. That uncertainty becomes one of the most important cracks in the case, because from this point forward, no one can definitively confirm that Emily is still sitting in that chair. At 2:05 p.m., another staff member glances toward the back while restocking cups. He reports seeing a laptop on the table, a drink beside it, but he does not recall seeing a person. At the time, it doesn't register as unusual. People step away from tables all the time. But this is where everything changes. At 2:17 p.m., the front door camera records a steady flow of customers exiting. Among them are individuals carrying bags, cups, laptops. Normal departures, normal movement. Nothing appears out of place, except for one detail investigators would focus on later. No one is seen carrying Emily's laptop. No one is seen carrying her bag, and Emily herself is not among them. At 2:46 p.m., the cafe begins to quiet down. The afternoon rush fades. Tables empty. Chairs shift. The back corner becomes visible again, at least partially. The laptop is still there. The drink is still there, but the chair is empty. At 2:52 p.m., a barista finally approaches the table. She assumes the customer stepped out and forgot their belongings. She waits a few minutes, expecting someone to return. When no one does, she informs the manager. At 3:07 p.m., the manager checks the laptop. It's still powered on. A design file open on the screen. No sign of forced closure. No indication of urgency. At 3:12 p.m., they attempt to locate the owner inside the cafe. No one claims the items. At 3:26 p.m., the decision is made to contact authorities. When police arrive, they treat it initially as a missing person case with unusual circumstances. The belongings suggest a sudden departure, but the footage suggests something else entirely. Detectives begin reviewing the surveillance video that same evening. They map every entry, every exit, every movement within the cafe, and the conclusion they reach feels impossible. Emily Carter entered the building and never left. But this is where the investigation takes a turn that, at the time, seems logical. Detectives focus on the most visible anomaly, the man in the gray hoodie. He becomes the center of attention almost immediately. His movements are irregular. His face is partially obscured. He appears near Emily's location at 2 different points in time. It feels like the answer. Security footage from nearby streets is pulled. Officers attempt to track him beyond the cafe. A similar figure is seen walking 3 blocks away at approximately 3:05 p.m., but the quality is too poor for confirmation. Still, the theory forms quickly. He approached Emily. Something happened off camera. He left with her, somehow avoiding direct detection. It's not perfect, but it's the only explanation that seems to fit. Within days, a composite image is released. Tips begin to come in. Dozens of reported sightings. None confirmed. The case gains local attention, then national coverage, and with it pressure, because there is something deeply unsettling about footage that appears complete, yet explains nothing. Weeks pass, then months. The man in the hoodie is never identified. No forensic evidence ties anyone to the scene. No financial activity appears on Emily's accounts. Her phone remains inactive after 12:32 p.m. And slowly, the investigation begins to stall. The working theory remains unchanged. The assumption is that something happened in that blind spot behind the column, something the cameras failed to capture. But this is the detail no one questions. If Emily left with someone, why didn't a single camera see her go? And more importantly, why did everyone stop looking for anything else? For nearly 9 months, the case of Emily Carter remained suspended in that single, impossible conclusion. She walked in, and somehow, she was never seen leaving. The footage was reviewed dozens of times. Detectives, analysts, even outside consultants all reached the same assumption. The answer had to be hidden in the blind spot behind the column. Whatever happened, happened there. And so, that's where everyone kept looking. But this is where everything changes. In March of 2024, a digital forensic analyst named Laura Bennett was brought in to conduct an independent review. Not because there was new evidence, but because there was nothing left to pursue. No suspects, no movement, no answers. Laura had one instruction: start from the beginning, not from the theory, not from the suspect, from the footage itself. She didn't begin with Emily. She didn't begin with the man in the hoodie. She began with the system, frame rates, camera sync, overlapping angles, time drift between devices, the things most people assume are already correct. And within the first 48 hours, she noticed something subtle. The cameras were not perfectly aligned. The front entrance camera was running approximately 11 seconds ahead of the back interior camera. It was a minor discrepancy, the kind that normally doesn't matter, but in a case built entirely on timing, 11 seconds is everything, because that gap created moments that never truly overlapped. Moments where someone could exist in one frame and not yet appear in another. Moments where something could happen without ever being seen as a complete sequence. But this wasn't the breakthrough. Not yet. Laura kept watching. Again, and again, and again. Not focusing on Emily. Not focusing on the suspect. focusing on the edges, the corners, the places people don't naturally look. Because, as she would later explain, most investigations fail in the same way. Everyone watches the subject. No one watches the background. And then she saw it. At 1:18 p.m. on the back camera, just seconds after the man in the hoodie moves toward the rear, there's a brief shift near the service corridor door. Not the main entrance. Not the customer exit. A narrow door behind the counter, used by staff for deliveries and trash removal. It sits at the far edge of the frame, barely visible, easy to ignore. For less than 2 seconds, the door opens. Not fully. Just enough to create a thin vertical line of darkness. And in that gap, a shape moves. Fast, deliberate. Then the door closes. No one reacts. No one looks. Because no one notices. But this is where everything unravels. Laura cross-references the front camera, adjusts for the 11-second offset, and finds something that had never been aligned correctly before. At what appears to be 1:18 p.m. on the front camera, but is actually 1 hour 18 minutes and 11 seconds relative to the back feed, a figure exits the cafe, not through the main door, but through a secondary side exit that leads into the service alley. The camera doesn't fully capture the person, just a partial frame, a shoulder, dark clothing, hair tied back, and something else, a gray sweater. Emily's sweater. The angle is imperfect, the image blurred by motion, but when stabilized and enhanced, the outline becomes clearer. It's her, leaving, in plain sight, just not where anyone thought to look, because that exit was never considered part of the customer flow. It wasn't monitored in the same way, and more importantly, no one had synchronized the footage correctly to see the movement as a continuous event. But that still left one question. Why didn't anyone inside notice her leaving? The answer was already in the footage. At the exact moment the service door opens, the delivery driver's boxes are being moved near the front. A brief obstruction, a shift in attention. The barista closest to the back is turned away. And the man in the gray hoodie? He's standing just close enough to block the line of sight from the nearest table. Not attacking. Not forcing, just positioning, creating a moment, a gap, an exit no one sees. And suddenly, the theory collapses. Emily was not taken by force. She walked out, but not alone. Laura continues digging. She isolates the frames where the man in the hoodie approaches the back area, enhances the footage, tracks his movement relative to Emily's position. There's no visible struggle. No sudden motion, but there is a pattern. At 1:17 p.m., when he approaches, Emily's posture shifts slightly, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like someone reacting to a quiet voice, someone speaking to her, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to get her attention. And then, within seconds, she closes her laptop halfway, not fully, just enough to suggest interruption. At the time, investigators assumed it meant nothing. Now it means everything, because it shows intent, not panic, not fear, a decision. Whatever was said to her made her stand up willingly. Laura traces the man's path again, and this time, she notices something else. At 12:41 p.m., when he first enters, he doesn't look at the menu. He looks at the back, directly toward Emily's table. Not scanning, not browsing, targeting, which means this was never random. He knew she would be there, or at least, he expected her to be. Phone records finally provide the missing link. On the morning of June 14th, just before 11:30 a.m., Emily received a message from an unknown number. It had been overlooked initially, dismissed as spam. The message read, "I'm in the area. Can we talk for 5 minutes?" No name, no context. But when investigators re-examined Emily's deleted messages, recovered through forensic extraction, they found earlier communication with a former client, a man named Ryan Hallbrook, a short-term contract from months earlier. No known conflict, No obvious reason for concern, except one detail. He had recently attempted to contact her multiple times, unanswered, and on June 14th, he was in Portland. Facial reconstruction and enhancement from the cafe footage, combined with DMV records, confirmed it. The man in the gray hoodie was Ryan Holbrook. He was located 3 weeks later in a neighboring state. When questioned, he denied any wrongdoing. He claimed Emily agreed to step outside to talk, said she seemed calm, said she left on her own. But he couldn't explain why he never came forward, why he never contacted police, why he disappeared after that day. And that silence became its own answer, because the evidence no longer relied on assumption. It relied on alignment, on timing, on a door that opened for less than 2 seconds, a movement in the corner of a frame, a moment everyone missed. Emily Carter did leave the coffee shop. The cameras captured it, just not in the way anyone expected. And the truth is, the footage never lied. It was simply misunderstood. In the end, the case didn't hinge on what was visible. It hinged on what was ignored. A misaligned timestamp, a background detail, a door no one thought mattered, and a single decision to look where no one else had. Because sometimes, the difference between a mystery and an answer is just 11 seconds. If there's anything this case leaves behind, it's a reminder that the truth is rarely hidden. It's usually right in front of us, waiting for someone to notice.